I'm a police officer with the Sûreté du Québec. This demonstration has become illegal. We order you to scatter and to leave the premises, otherwise we will have to intervene.
When I moved to Canada from London, I was shocked to read about the Quebec mosque shooting. Alexandre Bissonnette, a young man with strong alt-right tendencies, entered a mosque during evening prayers and opened fire, killing 6 defenseless people. I had heard about a rally happening in Quebec City, organised by far-right groups. I decided to drive up to witness the rally for myself. I knew that 2 of Canada's largest far-right groups were going to be there, Storm Alliance and La Meute. As I arrived at the protest, I was really nervous. I spotted the leader of Storm Alliance, Dave Treggett. I decided to approach him and to ask him a few questions about why he was here.
Donc vous êtes avec Storm Alliance. Qu'est-ce que vous représentez essentiellement et qu'est-ce que vous voulez, le message que vous voulez passer aujourd'hui?
Storm Alliance, c'est un mouvement citoyen qui dénonce la corruption et la tyrannie. On défend des valeurs comme la liberté d'expression, l'égalité homme-femme, la diversité intellectuelle, d'opinion, de religion, de croix, de foi, pas de croix, de foi, excuse-moi. La diversité de genre, religion, ethnicité, toutes des valeurs canadiennes en réalité. Aujourd'hui, on est venu dénoncer le mécontentement des gens envers les libéraux. C'est ce qu'on voulait faire.
Et vous trouvez des liens dans d'autres groupes avec un peu la même mentalité en Europe ou dans les États-Unis, ou vous êtes surtout focusé sur le Québec?
Storm Alliance, c'est pan-canadien. On s'entend qu'au Québec, c'est beaucoup plus gros qu'ailleurs, parce que le Québec, c'est beaucoup plus militant que le reste du pays.
I had mixed feelings about my experience at the far-right rally in Quebec City. My interview with the leader of Storm Alliance surprised me. I had expected him to speak about the danger of immigrants. However, he was very moderate and well-spoken. I began to question the media's fear of the far-right. And then, suddenly, in April and May, news of the far-right started to make headlines again. I tracked down CBC's Jonathan Montpetit and headed to meet him in his home in Montreal. In the last few years, he's quickly become the leading journalist on the subject, and La Meute especially has granted him an unprecedented level of access to their organisation.
Every time I've done a story about La Meute, I always expect, okay, this is going to be the last one because they're going to read it and they're going to finally realize that I don't share their opinions. And then there's one of my main contacts there, he always posts my story and says oh, what a nice guy I am. And so it's, on one hand, it's very unsettling. On the other hand, it's been great for access to them.
Do you see them as a threat to the multicultural Canadian society?
The KKK has had presence in Canada for many years. There were neo-Nazi movements in Toronto and Montreal in the 80s and 90s. So I think the danger is to assume that we are à l'abri, that we're sheltered, that Canadian culture is somehow exceptional and not, or above the threat of the far right. But what exists here exists as kind of an extension of this broader movement leaning towards authoritarianism, toward nativism, populism, that is kind of expressing some of this malaise that we're seeing within Western democracies. At the extreme end, of course, is something like Alexandre Bissonnette, something like the Quebec mosque shooting. This was somebody who had a steady diet of extreme right ideology. Most of what he consumed was not actually material from Quebec. Most of what he seemed to be consuming was alt-right stuff from the United States. But I do think it demonstrates that there can be a link between what somebody consumes and how they express themselves violently.
So Quebec obviously has a history of separatism, and I was wondering how the far-right groups today in Quebec approach the issue of political sovereignty.
I think it's more helpful when you talk about La Meute, not to speak about sovereignty per se, but to speak about Quebec nationalism. You know, something like illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is a great example. This has become one of the group's big concerns. They think, you know, how could we be treating illegal immigrants, it's their term, with such respect, and you know, basically we're carrying their luggage. So I think the border issue is such a potent issue. It's rife with symbolism, of course. You know, that the border, if you're a nationalist, you know, protecting the border is simply a must. I think there's no question that Roxham Road has become a flashpoint, wedge issue for the far right in Quebec.
I decided to drive down to the US-Canadian border to witness the protest. As I arrived, it became obvious that Storm Alliance hadn't shown up yet. Antifa, the anti-fascist organization, were waiting for them.
Today is to send a very clear message of welcome to the refugees who are over in those roulottes and the trailers over there, and to absolutely stop Storm Alliance from spreading their hate and getting anywhere near there.
After the organizer addressed the crowd, Antifa moved towards the highway.
Yeah. Go, take it. Before they block us, take it.
Embarquez sur le trottoir, allez dans le sens s'il te plaît.
Hey!
Recule! On demande de reculer, collaborer.
No, passera! They're there! The Storm Alliance are coming! The Storm Alliance are coming! Haitians in!
Racist out!
Mexicans in!
Racist out!
Muslims in!
Racist out!
This is just intimidation. They're not gonna do shit. They're not gonna do shit. Hey! Hey!
Mrs. Jane Goldie, she's a fucking fascist! Stop it! Stop it!
Take it! Take it!
No! Stop it! Stop it! Allez vous faire pointer une fois! Refugees in! Racist out!
The events at the border left me with more questions. Were the far right as big as a threat as Antifa made them out to be? Or was Antifa's violent actions just legitimizing the far right's position? About a decade ago, Maxime Fizet was briefly able to unite all of the major far-right groups in Quebec behind a common cause. But, after a string of arrests and a fallout with other neo-Nazis, he began to detach himself from this ideology. Today, he's a prominent public advocate against the radical extremism he once championed. I decided to reach out to him to learn from his first-hand perspective on the far-right, and he agreed to meet me in his hometown of Quebec City, outside the National Assembly, the location of my first far-right rally.
Oui, je crois que c'était où vous étiez pour la manifestation.
Ouais, ben c'est sûr que là, le landscape a changé un peu, là.
Ouais.
Moi, je m'étais mis, en fait, un bout à ce statut-là. Après ça, je m'étais approché ici. Il y avait comme un banc de neige. J'avais monté sur le banc de neige, puis j'avais filmé comme ça, comme en piqué, là. J'avais des bonnes images.
What attracted you to the far-right movement initially in your youth?
Well, I come from a very nationalist background, and it could have remained civic nationalism, but it took a much darker turn when I got interested into Nazi German history And I felt that our nation, Quebec, and our language was threatened by different religions and people from other cultures. It led me to engage in much more radical aspects of nationalism and eventually to found the Fédération des Québécois de souche, the Old Stock Quebecers Federation, along with other neo-Nazis that I knew at the time.
Did you ever have any violent thoughts or ideas about carrying out violent actions against people who didn't ascribe to the white supremacist ideology?
Yeah. Months after I was arrested, it was my darkest moment. I was depressed. I was living alone in a very crappy apartment in a very poor neighborhood. My roommates left me to pay all the bills. My fridge was empty. I wanted to die, okay? But when you're a radical and you want to die, you very rarely take your life without doing something bigger out of it. I guess my fantasies at the time were to trigger what some call RAHOA, the racial holy war. And it's a very common thought in the far-right movements that if some heinous enough act is committed, that it's going to trigger some kind of outrage and eventually lead to a bigger civil war that will make ultimately the right win. So at some times I was considering conducting a terrorist attack. I had several plans in my head, not actual plans, you know, like stuff I was planning to do, but some kind of dreams and scenarios that I was thinking of. Some of them were much more grim than others. Some involved a bomb that was pretty easy to make, by the way. I still remember how to.
When violent acts are committed, for instance, the Quebec City shooting carried out by Alexandre Bissonnet, how does the far right view these kind of acts? Do they try and disassociate themselves?
I think that in the beginning the far right was not conscious of their being part of the same political spectrum of Alexandre Bissonnet. But the more and more the proofs came out, the more and more far-right members came to realize that they were actually ideological brothers. I've also seen several members of far-right groups claiming that Alexandre Bissonnet is a hero, and that's no surprise.
What do you think the future holds for the far-right in Canada?
Power. Right now, nothing seems capable of stopping them. There's a significant risk that these elections, and we've seen it right now actually, are going to be more on the thematics of identity and immigration and religion. And that's sad because it's been over 10 years now and we still haven't moved past this. And even though groups such as La Meute may never be in a situation of power, their ideologies may, and that's just as dangerous.
When Fizet said, their ideologies may, and that's just as dangerous, that line really stuck with me. Especially given some of the events which began to unfold shortly after we held that interview. Atalante, the most extreme of all the right-wing groups, stormed the Vice media offices in Montreal. And, most shockingly for me, I discovered that one of the main leaders of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was from Montreal, a man who went by the name of Zyga, and that he'd been organising all these alt-right meetings with other neo-Nazis at the local Irish pub right down the road from me. I think I went off on this journey expecting to find this very far-removed community of far-right members, which I assumed to be in the very depths of Quebec. But actually, they were right on my doorstep, and they still are. And even though they might not want to gain political power, they're trying to change the discourse, and that might just be, like Maxime said, what the most frightening thing about this whole situation is.